All right, we will call the meeting to order. Members will take their seats. The full committee hearing this morning is on the role of allies and partners in U.S. military strategy and operations. First, I have what my staff has told me is a shortened script to explain the the remote participants in our meeting. I will point out that all of our witnesses this morning are going to be participating remotely. So, members who are joining remotely must be visible on screen for the purposes of identity verification, establishing and maintaining a quorum, participating in the proceeding, and voting. Those members must continue to use the software platform's video function while in attendance, unless they experience connectivity issues or other technical problems that render them unable to participate on camera. If a member experiences technical difficulties, they should contact the committee staff for assistance. Video of members' participation will be broadcast in the room and via the television/internet feeds. Members participating remotely must seek recognition verbally, and they are asked to mute their microphones when they are not speaking. This is actually important for all of us. Apparently, if we leave the microphones on when we're not talking, it causes feedback that we can't hear, but they can hear if they're online. Members who are participating remotely are reminded to keep the software platform's video function on the entire time they attend the proceedings. Members may leave and rejoin the proceeding. If members depart for a short while for reasons other than joining a different proceeding, they should leave the video function on. If members will be absent for a significant period or depart to join a different proceeding, they should exit the software platform entirely and then rejoin it if they return. Members may use the software platform's chat feature to communicate with staff regarding technical or logistical support issues only. Finally, I have designated a committee staff member to, if necessary, mute unrecognized members' microphones to cancel any inadvertent background noise that may disrupt the proceeding. So, as I mentioned up front, purpose of the hearing is on the role of allies and partners in U.S. military strategy and operations. We have 3 witnesses who will testify and then take our questions, all of whom, as I mentioned, are participating remotely, so they'll be on the screens in front of you. We have the Honorable Christine Warmuth, Director, International Security and Defense Policy Center for the RAND Corporation. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, retired, Center for European Policy Analysis, and former Commanding General, U.S. Army Europe. And Mr. Elbridge Colby, principal and co-founder of the Marathon Initiative. I think this is an enormously important topic and one I know many members of this committee have worked on for quite some time. It is incredibly important that we build the strongest possible alliances that we can, that we form partnerships and friendships wherever we can to help us achieve our goals. Because as has been pointed out in this committee by both members and DoD witnesses as well as others testifying, we face an incredibly complex series of threats, from a rising China to belligerent Russia, Iran, North Korea, transnational terrorist groups. It is a very complicated threat matrix and one which I would submit we cannot possibly meet on our own. We're going to need friends, we're going to need partners. Now, the good news in all this is we have about at least 75 years worth of developing those partnerships that have been robust and very successful for us, NATO being the most obvious, but we have very strong partnerships with South Korea and Japan and others in the Asian region. We have built these partnerships and they have been to our benefit, most notably immediately following 9/11. When NATO stepped up and defended us, and in Afghanistan today, we are getting to the point where our partners are actually going to have more military forces on the ground in Afghanistan than we do. These partnerships have undeniably worked. And when you look at the National Defense Strategy, partnerships and alliances are a cornerstone of that strategy. We need to figure out how to build and strengthen those partnerships as we look to meet the challenges that we face globally. And going forward, we can't take that for granted. It is a constantly shifting and changing world. Allies have their own interests and their own pursuits. We need to work at it if we're going to build those partnerships. And I believe that the United States military can be an important part of working those partnerships and developing them. Certainly, we need to use the other tools in our toolbox, diplomacy, development, use the State Department. But as I've traveled the world, one thing that is notable, people really appreciate the support of the U.S. military. The partnerships that we build certainly help us in meeting our national security objectives, but they also develop more sustainable and long-term relationships in Africa and Asia and Europe and elsewhere. So I think the military needs to be part of working together on those partnerships. And I think it's crucially important that we look at it that way. And I will say, I don't think an American-first philosophy actually achieves our interests. It really doesn't get America what it really wants. If we tell the rest of the world that we're in it for ourselves and we have no interest in working with them or even concerning ourselves with their objectives, in the long run, it undermines our credibility. And that's the last point that I want to make. That the president frequently talks about how the partnerships and alliances that we've had across the world are not to our benefit. He makes it clear that he thinks that the rest of the world is sort of a free rider on our largesse and what we have done for them. I don't agree with that. No country in the world has benefited more from the global stability, peace, and prosperity of the last 75 years than the United States of America. Those partnerships may be helping, South Korea, for instance, prevent a war on the Korean Peninsula, prevent being invaded by North Korea. They may be helping, Japan and Taiwan protect themselves against China, or Europe protect themselves against Russia. But they are also helping us because they are giving us a stable world. And as the most prosperous country in the history of the world, we benefit from that more than anybody else. I believe these partnerships have been of mutual benefit, and I think it is enormously important that we maintain them, strengthen them, and look for opportunities to build new partnerships where possible. And with that, I will yield to the ranking member for any opening statement he has.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join in welcoming and thanking our witnesses, and to thank you for having a hearing on what I agree is such an important topic. As Ms. Warmuth says in her statement, these alliances and partnerships give us a unique comparative advantage. And I know that General Dunford, when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, would make that point repeatedly as well. Ms. Warmuth goes on to say they are the backbone of the international order that has ensured relative peace and security since the end of World War II. I think that's right, yet in both political parties, there are doubts and questions and maybe even attacks on these alliances and partnerships that have been so successful since the end of World War II. So I think it's very important for us to remind ourselves and examine the benefits that the United States has received in the last 75 years through this network of alliances and partnerships, but also see how they need to be adjusted to meet the needs of today and also tomorrow. Of course, in thinking about World War II and alliances, I can't resist a couple of Churchill quotes. In a secret session in 1942, he said, "In working with allies, it sometimes happens that they develop opinions of their own." Well, that may be part of the challenge of working with allies. Our allies sometimes develop opinions of their own. We don't always perhaps give those opinions the respect they deserve. Later, just about a month before the war ended in 1945, Churchill said, "There is only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that is fighting without them." Well, I hope the United States never finds itself in that position again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will now go to our witnesses, who I'm counting on the system to magically appear on the screen. We're going to start with the Honorable Christine Warmuth. You are recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, and members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here to see you all again, even if it's just virtually. As powerful as the United States is as a nation, our allies and partners around the world are critical elements of our national security strategy, as you all both indicated. Particularly in an era of great power competition, the network of alliances and partnerships we've developed over the last 75 years provides us a unique comparative advantage. The U.S. and its allies share intelligence, train and exercise side by side, and operate compatible weapon systems on a daily basis, coming together to create combined capabilities that far exceed what we could bring to bear on our own. Chairman Smith spoke to the value that our allies and partners have brought to us in the past. Today in Europe, we're working closely with our NATO allies to deter Russia, while at the same time guarding against internal threats to freedom driven by ethno-nationalism and nationalism. In Asia, our alliances with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and our partnerships with others in the region strengthen our ability to confront a range of threats, whether it is North Korea's growing nuclear weapons and missile program, China's military buildup and sweeping territorial claims, or the continuing threat of violent extremism. It's become almost a cliche to say that the United States is at a strategic inflection point, or even facing the end of the world order as we know it. Whatever you call it, the country is facing now significant challenges ahead, most prominently competing successfully against a rising China while reducing the risks of war with Beijing. This is going to require us to change our national security approach, a challenging assignment under any circumstances, but will be all the more difficult because of the inevitable downward budgetary pressure on national security institutions that is coming, and the many other difficult domestic problems that are going to compete for policymakers' time and attention. Allies and partners remain critically important in this changing landscape, but we need to adapt and strengthen our networks to better position us for the future. The U.S. needs to shore up deterrence in Europe and Asia, while at the same time carefully reducing its military footprint in the Middle East without creating greater insecurity there. Going forward, we also need our allies and partners to do more for themselves, as well as in some cases. We need our NATO allies to continue to spend more on defense and to make good on to do so by 2024. We need our allies and partners to continue working with us, whether it's in the Middle East as part of the maritime coalition to interdict weapon shipments to the Houthis, or in the South China Sea, where Australia and Japan have joined this year to conduct freedom of navigation operations and to conduct naval exercises. Developing a comprehensive plan to adapt and revitalize our networks and alliances is an essential component of our strategy for great power competition, and a homework assignment that's going to take many years. It's also an area where DoD needs help from Congress. DoD is going to have to make difficult decisions about the kinds of weapon systems it buys, how it's postured overseas, and what kinds of capabilities it's willing to sell and not sell to allies and friends. Congress is involved in all of these decisions, and without congressional support for the tough calls that lie ahead, it's going to be much harder to make the strategic adjustments we so clearly need to undertake. America's network of alliances has served us well, but we can't take these relationships for granted. Alliances are like gardens. They don't grow overnight. You have to tend to them, and they can wither if you neglect them. While the current national strategy emphasizes the importance of allies, I'm concerned that a widening gap has emerged between our rhetoric and the actions the United States taken in some cases with our closest friends and allies. Commitment to NATO's Article 5 security guarantee has repeatedly been called into question. Washington has accused our European allies of taking us for granted, and President Trump has seemed to contemplate possibly withdrawing from NATO altogether. The decision to withdraw as many as 12,000 troops from Germany has been publicly messaged as a punishment, and it makes strategic sense in today's environment. The abrupt decision to withdraw troops from Syria took our allies and friends by surprise and left them wondering when we could be counted on. The U.S. and its allies need each other now more than ever, but increasing friction and uncertainty in our relationships can result in negative consequences. A survey released last week showed favorable views of the United States in several democratic countries is at an all-time low. Ultimately, shared interests and concerns and common threats lie at the heart of strong alliances. But nations and their leaders, as Ranking Member Thornberry said, must balance many competing demands and pressures to govern. So it's rare that we will always agree. In closing, and sustaining alliances requires persuasion, consultation, an ability to listen, and a willingness to compromise. If we don't do a better job tending our gardens, we may find ourselves with friends who are willing to take on the hard work that we need in the days ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we It was a little broken up there, but I think we by and large heard everything in that. I hope the future connections here are better. General Hodges, you are up now, and you are recognized.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I would like to address three specific topics in my opening statement: U.S. capabilities in Europe, the importance of the Black Sea region, and the importance of our relationship with Turkey. U.S. strategic interests are shifting increasingly towards the Indo-Pacific region, but the relationship with Europe remains vital to American security and prosperity, which in turn depends in large part on European security and prosperity. We need allies for support around the world, and our best and most reliable allies come from Europe, as well as Canada and Australia. NATO, the most successful alliance in the history of the world, is an essential element of U.S. security efforts in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. The current U.S. posture in Europe is understandably significantly less than what it was at the height of the Cold War. But given the security environment now, it is too small and without depth. In order to carry out U.S. strategy in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, we depend on continuous deployments of rotational, regular, and reserve air, land, and naval forces to augment the relatively small U.S. military capabilities forward-based in Europe. The decision to withdraw 12,500 soldiers and airmen from Germany, as described on 29 July by the Pentagon, is a mistake in my view. The administration's decision is not the result of strategic analysis or a coordinated interagency process. It appears that the planning will take months and the execution will take years. My estimate is that what actually ends up happening will probably bear little resemblance to what was initially briefed. Russia has not improved its behavior anywhere. And in the face of that, we would be reducing capabilities essential to effective deterrence, rapid reinforcement, and operations in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. My sense is that the plan as briefed will have a negative impact on readiness. But there are smart professionals in the Pentagon and in the various headquarters in Germany who will lay out the challenges and risks and try to come up with means to mitigate those risks and a timeline in which to do it. NATO is still capable of effective deterrence. The combined militaries of 3 allies plus partners in Europe represent significant potential combat power and is a key component of effective deterrence. However, I do believe that there are potential vulnerabilities which undermine NATO's along its eastern flank. Those include, number one, the lack of cohesion, which could lead to miscalculation by the Kremlin, inadequate readiness levels of some allies, inadequate integration of air and missile defense capabilities, and shortfalls in military mobility. The second point of emphasis regards the strategic importance of the greater Black Sea region. I believe that great power competition prevents great power conflict. Failure to compete and to demonstrate interest and a willingness to protect those interests in all domains can lead to power vacuums and miscalculations, which can in turn lead to escalation of tensions and to actual conflict. This is particularly true in the greater Black Sea region, where Russia is attempting to maintain a sphere of influence. The Black Sea region should be the place where the United States and our NATO allies and partners hold the line. The Black Sea should matter to the West in part because it matters to the Kremlin. Taking the initiative away from the Kremlin, denying the ability to support the Assad regime in Syria and launch operations into Libya, will reduce the flow of refugees into Europe, what General Breedlove called the weaponization of refugees, and limit the Kremlin's ability to spread its corrosive influence in the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa. We need to change the rules of the game, develop our own approach to hybrid warfare, and shape events by using all the tools of national and alliance power, including diplomacy, private investment, as well as military, instead of always reacting to Kremlin. Finally, my third point of emphasis, it is time for Turkey USA 2.0. We must repair the relationship between Turkey and the United States and see Turkey as an essential but exposed ally that is at the crossroads of several regions and challenges. Turkey is essential for deterrence of the Kremlin in the Black Sea region, and it is a critical bulwark against ISIS and Iran. Protecting this relationship to be a priority. I do not condone or excuse several mistakes or bad choices by the Turkish government. They are at times a very difficult ally, but we must think long term. The current Turkish administration will eventually change, but the strategically important geography of Turkey will never change. We need to reframe the relationship from its Cold War structures. The current boundaries between U.S. European Command and U.S. Central Command and the Department of State regional boundaries currently align with the Turkish-Syrian border. Perhaps we can find something that is more mindful of Turkey's strategic situation and which would improve our own strategic thinking. In order to start rebuilding trust with Turkey, we should respect Turkish concerns about providing weapons to the YPG. We should recognize that Turkey is on the front line of the Middle East refugee crisis, with more than 3.5 million refugees in Turkey along the Syrian border. We should offer Turkey a way out from its misguided S-400 purchase from Russia. We should resolve the Turkey-Greece issues in the Eastern Mediterranean. If the U.S. is not willing to lead this effort, then we should put full weight behind Germany or the UK to do it. The Kremlin benefits if two NATO allies are in conflict with each other. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And up next, we have Mr. Colby. Mr. Colby, you are recognized to give your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Thornberry, and distinguished members of this committee for the invitation to appear before you. It's a great honor to testify before this body on a topic of the highest importance to our nation. Allies and partners are absolutely essential for the United States in a world increasingly defined by great power competition, above all with China. Indeed, they lie at the very heart of the right U.S. strategy for this era, which I believe the Department of Defense's 2018 National Defense Strategy lays out. The importance to the United States of allies and partners is not a platitude, to the contrary. For the first time since the 19th century, the United States is not far and away the world's largest economy. More than anything else, this is due to the rise of China. And as has become very evident, Beijing is increasingly using its growing power for coercive purposes. At the same time, the United States faces a range of other potential threats, including primarily from Russia against NATO, as well as from transnational terrorists, Iran, and North Korea. In other words, there exist multiple challenges to U.S. national security interests, but given their breadth and scope, America can no longer expect to take care of them essentially alone. Accordingly, we must address this widening shortfall between the threats we face and the resources we have to deal with them by a much greater role for allies and partners. Precisely because of this, the NDS identifies a new approach to U.S. allies and partners as its critical second line of effort. This new approach is not simply a restatement that allies and partners are important and valued, as appropriate as that may be. Rather, it is a call for a new logic for dealing with them. This new approach proceeds from the NDS's revised strategic perspective. Because of China's power and wealth, the United States simply must play a leading role in blocking Beijing's pursuit of hegemony in Asia. This means that the U.S. defense establishment must prioritize dealing with China in Asia, and particularly on defending vulnerable allies and partners such as Taiwan and the Philippines. Given the high demands of this requirement, it will have to consume an increasing portion of U.S. defense effort and attention. In particular, we will not be able to dedicate the level of resources and effort to the Middle East and Europe that we have in the past. We will therefore need allies and partners to do their part, not just to help defend our interests and enable a concentration on Asia, but to defend themselves and their interests. So the question is how. Let me lay out 3 points in this respect. First, the United States should seek to add new partners and, where necessary, allies. Washington should seek to add them to address a particular mismatch between where the contemporary dangers to our interests present themselves and the threat perceptions of most of our established allies. The contemporary threats to U.S. interests stem from China across Asia, transnational terrorists largely in the Middle East, Russia and Eastern Europe, Persian Gulf area, and North Korea in Asia. Yet the United States' traditional closest and most significant allies are largely clustered in Western Europe and Northeast Asia. Many of these countries, especially in Europe, feel quite secure and are little motivated to contribute to more distant threats. This leaves wide areas, such as South and Southeast Asia and the Middle East, for which long-standing U.S. alliances are of minimal help. The natural way to rectify this is for the United States to add partners and, where necessary, alliances to help address these gaps. Fortunately, there is plenty of opportunity to do so because many countries that are not our traditional close allies share our interest in checking Chinese bid for hegemony in Asia, resisting Russian or Iranian aggression, or combating transnational terrorism. Facing these threats more acutely than do our long-established allies, these countries are highly motivated to do something about the problem. In this effort, though, we should be very careful to distinguish between expanding our formal alliances or quasi-alliances from expanding our partnerships. The former should be approached conservatively, while the latter can be approached more liberally. When we extend an alliance commitment or something tantamount to it, as in the case of Taiwan, we tie our credibility to that nation's fate. We should therefore be chary about doing so. In light of this, we should seek to expand our partnerships wherever possible. In particular, we should focus on increasing them in South and Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, where China otherwise might have an open field to suborn states and add them to its pro-hegemonial coalition. I do not see a near-term need to add any allies to the U.S. roster, but I do think we will increasingly need to consider this as the shadow of Chinese power darkens over the region. Further, our effort to expand our network of allies and partners should primarily be focused on states with shared threat perceptions. It has become something of a commonplace that shared values form the bedrock of our alliances. It is true that such values help bind allies, but the most useful alliances generally proceed from shared fears. The best motivator to fight is self-defense. Thus, states that have a shared interest in preventing Chinese or Russian or Iranian hegemony themselves have a natural alignment with our own interests. This is true whether or not they are democracies. Second, given the scale of challenges we face, the United States should encourage allies and partners to assume a greater role in handling shared security challenges. This is, of course, a burden-sharing problem, and it is a difficult one. I do not think there is a neat solution to the burden-sharing quandary. The fact is that most countries will only do so much if they do not feel directly threatened by an adversary. My view is that we should work with this reality rather than vainly try to alter it. Accordingly, we should focus on urging countries to increase their efforts where they will be able to generate sufficient political will to make an effective contribution to shared interests. In Asia, given the scale of the threat posed by Beijing, we should concentrate most of our allies like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Taiwan on readying to defend themselves alongside U.S. armed forces and provide access to U.S. forces in the event of a contingency. Meanwhile, we should assist partners like Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia with whatever means available to enable their defense against an ever more powerful China, while concurrently seeking greater access and logistics support for U.S. and other allied forces. In the Middle East, the United States should urge Israel and Washington's Arab partners to take a greater role in containing Iran and combating transnational terrorism. In Europe, finally, the overall U.S. goal should be, while preserving the fundamental U.S. commitment to NATO's defense, to have Europeans, especially in Northern and Eastern Europe, shoulder more of the burden of defending the alliance from Russian assault. The reality is that, given the stakes and consequences, the United States must prioritize Asia. The United States must therefore economize in its second theater, Europe. The main challenge to this revised model in Europe is Germany. The simple fact is that, given its size and wealth, Germany's role is critical. It can and should do much more for NATO European defense. Finally, the United States should act to make this invigorated network of allies and partners more effective. In this light, we should seek to integrate our own force development, posture, and war planning processes as much as possible with allies like Japan, Australia, the United Kingdom, and select others relevant to key scenarios. The goal here should be to make the collective efforts are as efficient as possible, reducing duplication and getting the most out of our efforts and money. At the same time, we should seek wherever possible to strengthen important partners in their ability to resist Chinese coercion or aggression or otherwise contribute to goals. Congress has already done much on this front, but we should intensify the use of arms sales, technology transfers, and related military intelligence tools to build up states in India, Vietnam, and other South and Southeast Asian states. In this vein, we must fundamentally move away from using these tools as leverage for key partners for domestic political reform or for secondary geopolitical objectives. The United States should always, of course, stand proudly for free government that treats its people with dignity. We must keep our eye on the prize, though. China is the primary challenge to our interests in the world, including our free government, both at home and abroad. Our top priority must therefore be to block its gaining predominance in Asia, which is a very real prospect. This means strengthening states in the region against Chinese power, whether or not they are model democracies. In closing, this new approach to allies and partners will involve uncomfortable changes, hard decisions and compromise, as well as some friction with them. But the truth is that we are much stronger with allies and partners, and our power is magnified when we effectively align our efforts. Done right, the end result will be a more powerful, equitable, and sustainable coalition of states together standing up for the kind of world Americans want and need to be secure, free, and prosperous. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. We'll now move to questions. We'll take members in order. The members in the audience can come forward when they're called and take a seat at the desk on the right and the left there. I'm not sure when votes are going to happen. It would be my intention to continue the hearing through votes, since we have roughly 45 minutes of a vote. We can have the member who are asking the question can stay here, and I think we can shuffle back and forth reasonably well to avoid any conflict there. So we'll keep going through votes is the plan. With that, Mr. Colby, I'll start with you, building off of what you said at the end there, and I think you perfectly outlined the main area where alliances are so important in Asia and the reason for it because of China. You mentioned arms sales as one way to build those alliances. What are some of the other key steps, and not just within the military realm? I think you very correctly outlined the countries, particularly in some cases the island nations in the South Pacific. What can we do? What should we do, either diplomatically, through aid, through policies? What's going to make those countries want to ally with us and not China? What are those key steps beyond, I think, as I said, I think you mentioned arms sales. What else should be in our toolbox when we look at how to deal with China by building those alliances?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your words. I think it's definitely a whole government approach. So, I think the economic, political, diplomatic pieces are obviously going to be vital. Arms sales are part of it, but I think a signal of political and commitment that's commensurate with what those states can sort of process is also appropriate. I think the administration's clarification of the Mutual Defense Treaty to Manila, that it applies to the South China Sea, stating our rejection of China's claims in the South China Sea more forthrightly, are evidences of resolve. I think fundamentally we have an alignment of interest because most of the states, certainly the more powerful states in the region like Vietnam, Indonesia, etc., do not want to be dominated by China. They don't want to be put on the spot, but I think whatever we can do to empower them, and as I think you were suggesting, sir, the economic piece of this is really important. So I'd commend, for instance, what the Japanese and the Koreans, for instance, have been doing to invest more. I think Congress played a very important role with the BUILD Act. But as you say, I think it's, or indicated, it's a whole of government approach.
Understood. And I think the other key point that you made there was basically saying we need to stay focused on the importance of those alliances because of China. And obviously the conflict we always run into there is with our values, with human rights, with democracy. And just a couple of examples of that, and curious how you think we should handle it. Obviously with the Philippines, we have problems with Duterte and the way he's doing criminal justice, amongst other things. So we've got that. With India is still doing arms sales back and forth with Russia. We've seen that problem with Turkey as well. Is it possible to get a little more specific about, when should we just say, look, we're not going to worry about your domestic politics. We want to build the alliance however possible. How would we deal with, extreme human rights abuses as are alleged in the Philippines in terms of extrajudicial killings, or in the case of India, and of course we're dealing with this with Turkey and Europe as well, is doing the arms sales with Russia. Should we significantly back off on our sort of sanctions policy for those things? And if so, how do we signal that without undermining our credibility?
Well, sir, I think you put your finger on. It is a very difficult problem, and I don't want to simplify it. I think my inclination would be that our benefit is we benefit as much as possible from their ability to defend themselves from Chinese coercion, particularly military coercion. So I would tend to air gap those kinds of capabilities, for instance, in thinking about domestic political or human rights abuses or engagements with Russia. I also think, and others would know more about this, but I think if you look at some of the best examples of influence on human rights, say in the Cold War, it was often from a sort of a close position. I think if you look, for instance, at the pressure on Taiwan or South Korea, I think in the case of the Philippines as well, it was often from a place where they felt quite confident in our having their back in terms of the kind of fundamental external threat, but also the ability to put pressure in an appropriate way, sort of more privately. And I guess that would be one thing. I would say, I think private pressure, as I think this was President Reagan's view and Secretary Schultz, that can be very effective. And also maybe thinking ourselves, and I don't pretend to have the answer, but it's one thing to, or maybe think more narrowly about what are the kinds of abuses that we particularly want to focus on in terms of holding up the sort of crown jewels of arms sales and so forth, versus sort of other things like improvement on, democratic norms and these kinds of things that we may be able to hold off a bit on. So I don't pretend to have the right answer, but I do think that we risk losing these countries, and the coming years are going to be critical, as I think you were suggesting, because the Chinese are so powerful and they are going to, face a bit of crossroads. We don't want to push them in the wrong direction at this critical level.
Understood. And I think one of the other things that we need to be careful about is perhaps our rhetoric and the expectations that we set. I think a lot of times, and this has happened in Democratic and Republican administrations, admittedly not so much in this one, is if our rhetoric is, we will stand up for human rights, we will protect anybody in the world, and then our actions don't match that rhetoric, that undermines our credibility. I think we should state more clearly up front the modest goals. And we have a modest ability to force other countries to act in certain ways. I think we'd be better served to acknowledge that and the pragmatic nature of the approach that we'll have to take. That's all I have. I will say, as we're asking questions, given the fact that it's virtual, it's really kind of important for the people asking the questions to direct it to one of our specific witnesses, so that we know who to pull up on the screen and all of that as we work through it. With that, I'll yield to Mr. Thornberry.
Mr. Colby, let me just inquire about another facet of what you were just discussing, because this has proven to be a troublesome problem for the United States in the past. I'm thinking, in addition to arms sales and the things you and the chairman were talking about, military training and exchanges. We have a law that says we cannot do training, sometimes for a whole unit, that has been accused of certain human rights violations. And as in my experience, a lot of countries desire most some sort of training exchanges with our military, the kinds of countries we'd like to make closer partnerships with, and yet our own law prevents us from having that sort of thing. We've had terrible fights in Congress for years about a military training facility devoted to South and Central America as another example. Chairman mentioned Philippines. Help us think through, I mean, you were doing that with the chairman, kind of the pluses and minuses, but when it comes to military training, other sorts of contact with our military, how does that apply in our desire to form greater partnerships with countries that may not be our idea of an ideal democracy?
Well, sir, I fully agree with you, and thank you for raising the training point. I would say, I mean, if we think about the scale of the military threat posed by the PRC, today and going forward. And I think within the next decade or so, we will be thinking about the Philippines and South Korea and other states in Southeast Asia as potential scenarios, given where the 2020 military defense or the military power report on China is saying. We need to start thinking about this now. I think training is a critical part because, in a sense, what we're going to need to do to leverage this greater power of this network, allies, partners, whatever the role, is going to be interoperability, the ability to work to different standards, to communicate with each other. That's partially a technical problem and an equipment problem, but a lot of it is just a human training and an organizational issue. In fact, Taiwan, I think I'm very enthusiastic about the arms sales to Taiwan, and I know that one was recently reported. I hope it goes through because it's the kind of equipment that we would want to see, this kind of A2AD denial kind of capabilities to Taiwan. But actually where I think, would be really valuable to move forward with them, and that's obviously a sensitive issue, but I think this would be within the context of our traditional policy, would precisely be on training, and that's something we could think about with Vietnam as well. Obviously, the Indians have a very sophisticated military, but there may be we can offer there too. So I think that's a real sort of force multiplier.
General Hodges, let me just pursue this a little bit with regard to Turkey, which you specifically mentioned. I think your broad points Turkey's geography, history, critical role is always going to be important, is certainly valid. And yet, not only are there human rights and governance issues, the current leader of Turkey has policies that contradict in many ways, the best interests of the United States. So take that specific example. We don't want to make enemies of Turkey forever, but yet what do we do now to preserve that future when there's a different government, but yet make clear or in some way help guide them on a better policy path?
Thank you, Mr. Thornberry. Well, first of all, Turkey is a maddening ally. I was stationed in Izmir for 2 years, so I personally experienced what it was like there. But yet, at the end of the day, I cannot imagine our alliance without Turkey, and so that's got to guide our actions. I think that part of the problem is, for decades, the boundary between Central Command and European Command has aligned with the border between Turkey and Syria. And when you think about the situation in the region right now, we would never put the boundary right there if we were starting with a blank sheet of paper. And because Central Command has been the main effort theater for the last 20 years, what Central Command's priorities would typically drive the thinking. And so I think, for example, we made a strategic error by giving weapons to the YPG. There were benefits to it at the tactical level, but the YPG ISIS was never going to be an existential threat to the United States or even to any European countries. And so we've risked a very important strategic partnership for what I think are tactical benefits. So my point is how we have Turkey on the map. Every NATO map, Turkey's at the bottom right-hand corner, and the thinking is dominated by what's south of that border. I think that's part of it. The second part is rebuilding trust. Turkey has a very unfortunate or bad history with Russia. I think they're 0 for 12 or 1 in 12 in their wars with Russia. And right now they have no confidence that the West will stick with them. I'm not excusing President Erdogan's policies, which are very, very bad for the people of Turkey. But when we're thinking about strategic calculation, what's in our best interest? And I think that we've got to continue to try and reestablish trust with them, as well as hold them accountable in the different ways that the U.S. government is still able to do.
Yeah, and I think figuring that out is the challenge. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Davis is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your all being here. I know that Mr. Colby, you spoke of how we need allies and partners to do their part. And I want to ask you and Ms. Warmuth to weigh in as well. What do you think the appropriate cost share for our allies should be versus the benefits gained through those alliances? Can you be as specific as possible?
Certainly, Congresswoman, I wouldn't be able to give you a dollar figure, but I think, I think fundamentally, if I was going to be sort of candid about it, I would say that Japan should strive to look more like what West Germany looked like in the Cold War, which is exactly the figure, but a considerably higher proportion of defense spending, largely focused on territorial defense. There may be other scenarios in the Russian Pacific that Japanese, as I mentioned, Taiwan should be prepared to help with, but largely focused on maintaining the integrity of the Japanese archipelago. I think in Europe we have a standard which is 2%, which we should stick to. Obviously there's always reason to critique it, but I mean fundamentally I think the reality is that the United States military is not large enough and almost certainly not large enough to fight two simultaneous wars against both China and Russia. And because China is a priority, that means Europe has to be prepared to do more. Certainly until U.S. forces can prudently be swung. But I think, we do have examples of allies like Poland and actually South Korea spends a pretty solid proportion of GDP on defense. Taiwan is making significant efforts to increase its defense spending. And actually, a number of our partners do very well. I mean, Finland, India, Vietnam. I think something a little bit more like that is kind of what we're looking for.
Ms. Warmuth, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yes, and I'm hoping you all can hear me a little bit better this time. I would agree with everything that Mr. Colby just said, and add maybe a few thoughts. I think, again, it's very important that the European members of NATO continue to make progress towards the 2% GDP pledge in 2024. But I think, you know, we oversimplify and sort of focus in a myopic way on that 2% number. Right. It's as important as how much countries are spending is what they're spending that money on. So I'm as interested as seeing Germany, for example, you know, go from, I think, about 1.2% of GDP to the 2% mark. But I'm also focused on, are they spending that defense money on the right kinds of capabilities that we need to be able to deter Russia, for example? I would also add that in addition
can I
to
ask
the
you, I was just going to ask you, when we've tried to intervene in that area and be, I guess, more forceful in terms of what we're looking for, what kind of results have we had?
Well, I think in my experience, the German military and many in the Ministry of Defense are very sympathetic, frankly, to the calls from the United States to invest more. I think they see the challenges that Russia poses. They see the reality of that, and they want their own country to be able to do more. But Germany, like all countries, like our own countries, its leaders are trying to balance a range of competing pressures. They are looking at their domestic issues. They're looking at the economic effects of the pandemic on their country. And so they're sort of looking at a broader array of things and making judgments about how to allocate their overall national resources. So there's work to be done, and I really think Germany in particular needs to step up. But I would also say that beyond just defense spending, alliances, countries that are part of the alliances with the United States and who have partnerships with us bring other things to the table as well. So for example, while Germany may not be doing as much as I'd like on defense, they are taking, you know, real pain in terms of the economic sanctions against Russia. Similarly, you know, you see countries in Asia who are part of the sanctions regime against North Korea. So I think facing access, willingness to sort of take economic losses as part of sanctions regimes are important contributions to our alliances as well.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask General Hodges really quickly, I mean, what is one thing that you learned at the Department of Defense about the role of alliances and how to achieve U.S. national security? Can you give us one thing?
And I'm sorry, it's going to have to be real quick because she's out of time. Okay. If you can do it in 5 seconds, go ahead.
We lose without allies.
I'm sorry, I missed that.
We lose without allies.
We lose.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Wilson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing in regard to our allies and partners. In the last year, I've had the remarkable opportunity to see the successes of President Trump around the world. I was in Krakow, Poland, where the people are so appreciative of the additional American troops being added there. In fact, the deterrence to Putin aggression. Indeed, President Duda has indicated that the military facilities they're going to build for the Americans could be called Fort Trump. In Israel, in Jerusalem, I was grateful to be present at the embassy that President Trump had the courage to move to Jerusalem. And then we saw last week with Prime Minister Netanyahu the extraordinary relationship the United States has with the Jewish state. And then I had the opportunity with India to be present with Prime Minister Narendra Modi in New Delhi and in Houston, where the people of India now appreciate that President Trump had the courage to rename Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command. They now understand what an important ally the world's largest democracy is to the world's oldest democracy, the United States. And then to visit in Bahrain, to see the American naval base there that has been so important for 70 years to provide security in the Middle East, and for then now Bahrain to take a lead in the Abraham Accords, which will bring peace and prosperity opportunity to the Middle East. And finally, with Colombia, I'm very grateful that in South America, the South Carolina National Guard is a state partner with the military of Colombia. We've never had a stronger relationship to deter terrorism around the world with President Trump. With that, Mr. Colby, last summer, the House passed a bill that I co-led with Representative Ted Deutsch, the U.S.-Israel Cooperation Enhancement and Regional Security Act. That bill included $3.8 billion a year in security assistance to Israel over the next decade. It would also provide financing to upgrade most of Israel's fighter aircraft, improve its ground forces mobility, and strengthen its military defense systems. What are some of the emerging threats to Israel, and how can we target security assistance to Israel to be effective?
Thank you, Congressman. I think I need to consult the bill to understand it better, but it sounds very commendable. I think we are certainly benefit. Essentially, the stronger Israel is, the better off we are. I think from things that have been happening in the last couple of months, the Abraham Accords and these hopefully more steps, I think we're seeing hopefully real progress in the sort of further cohesion and formalization of a coalition in the region designed to check and really roll back Iranian pursuit of dominance in the area. So I think that's very, very encouraging. In terms of Israel's particular threat perceptions, I wish I was able to speak in great detail, but I think it seems to me that the primary threat they feel is largely Iran, Hezbollah, obviously some of the rejectionist groups. It seems like things are in a pretty sustainable place on the rejectionist front with Hezbollah. I know they learned a lot of lessons. Dave Johnson, Christine Warmuth's colleague at RAND, wrote a very important study on Israel's adaptation that we could learn a lot from. So I would say we could learn a lot from the Israelis. I know we do. But I would say, I think building on this, as I mentioned in my testimony, and really encouraging and empowering regional partners to take a greater role. And of course, that's all the more tenable and feasible now that they're becoming more cohesive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then for General Hodges, Germany has so many important military facilities, and in fact, the Army Corps of Engineers is building the largest military hospital, the Rhine Ordnance Barracks Army Medical Center near Kaiserslautern, Germany, which is the sister city of Columbia, South Carolina. Very important to all of us. But I'm concerned that with the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline nearing completion, what steps should be taken to limit the exposure of our strategic installations in this growing threat?
Well, Mr. Wilson, for sure, we should keep up the pressure on Germany to discontinue the Nord Stream 2 construction. I think actually the poisoning of Mr. Navalny has changed a lot of attitudes here in Germany about how it views the Kremlin. So gives some hope there. But I think the United States, we've got to treat Germany as our most important ally. Instead, for the last several years, we've been public and treating them in a way that I guarantee you, I live here in Frankfurt, Germany, does not hinder any willingness to increase spending or to do the kind of things that the United States would like. So I think we need a more sophisticated approach to what we ask from the Germans.
The gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. Mr. Langevin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by thanking our witnesses for being here today to discuss the very important topic of our allies, certainly an important and timely topic. As I see it, the United States has allies, whereas China has business partners, and other countries know the difference. And previous administrations have understood that the best time to make a friend is when you don't need one. So I'd like to first ask about our efforts to make inroads in the South Pacific. Ms. Yarmuth and Mr. Colby, what value would partnerships with small island nations play in deterring China, for example, from attacking Taiwan or Guam? And next, what role should the Department of State play in cultivating allies and partnerships versus the role of the Department of Defense? And are we striking the right balance and what are the implications of getting that wrong? And then finally, General Hodges, as our cyber capabilities mature and cyber becomes increasingly important as a vast attack space, if you will, we will clearly need stronger cyber partnerships with European partners. Have European partners been willing to partner bilaterally with the U.S. On joint cyber operations? And which countries have most interest in and could benefit most from U.S. mentorships in developing their capabilities? We can start with Ms. Warmuth and Colby and go to General Hodges.
So, apologies, Congressman. It was a bit hard to hear you, but I think you said start with me, so I'll just try to be very brief. Yeah. The island nations can be quite important. As Mr. Colby said, we need to make adjustments to our posture in the region to be able to better deal with China. And so the announcement by Palau, for example, that it's willing to host U.S. airfields and bases could be quite helpful to us. Even though they're relatively small, we do need to diversify our footprint and be less, be more balanced and not so heavily weighted in Northeast Asia exclusively, for example. On the balance between the military and the Department of State has a very important role to play. As much as we need to have military capabilities to deter China, we also need to have a diplomatic effort, for example, to push back on their sweeping territorial claims. And the Department of State is essential to working with allies and partners to put forward diplomatic letters, for example, basically registering disagreement with China's sweeping territorial claims. We don't want to, I think, there's a tendency as big as the U.S. military is to, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But many of the challenges China poses, the economic challenges, for example, are better addressed with non-military tools. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Langeman. Yeah, I agree with Ms. Warmuth that the Pacific Islands are really critical. It sounds a little bit archaic, but fundamentally, the tyranny of distance, as General Hodges would know better than I, is really significant in military affairs. And this is even more the case now that China is not just building an 3D military, but a power protection military out beyond the first island chain. And so they will be seeking to have the ability to contest our power projection ocean. And we'll need to have combat credible forward forces designed to blunt a fait accompli or deny a Chinese assault, say, on Taiwan, I think, sir, as you rightly indicated. But that's going to need to be supplied. It's going to need to be based. It's going to need to be dispersed. I think the Marines are thinking really at the forefront of thinking about this, but it's a big logistics requirement, and that's where the Pacific really do come in great importance. So I think they sort of, it's a little bit back to the future, if you will, but I think they really are critical, and as Christine indicated, the pullout is significant.
And General, if you could address the cyber question.
Yes, sir. Thank you. First of all, 5 European allies stand out as being leaders in cyber developments with whom we do a lot of work. Germany, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the United Kingdom. Those are 5 good partners. Cyber protection of transportation infrastructure is essential for U.S. efforts in Europe. The port of Bremerhaven, for example. If that's not protected from a cyber strike, then we cannot bring in a single vehicle or a single soldier. So I believe cyber protection of critical transportation infrastructure ought to count towards 2%. Lithuania and Latvia do that now. I think Germany how to do this as well.
Very good. Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Turner is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are going to be directed to General Hodges to give our witnesses and the tech people a little advance warning. General Hodges, good to see you again. Thank you for your continued service in the area of national security. You mentioned your time in service at Izmir, where you were the commander of the NATO Land Command, and of course you were the commander of the commanding general of U.S. Army Europe. During that period, you saw an unbelievable shift in Russians' aggressiveness, also our unpreparedness, and our allies without a unified view of the effects of the need to deter Russia. You also saw the beginning of the European Reassurance Initiative and that evolved into the European Defense Initiative. We have air policing in the Baltics, exercises in the Black Sea. We have forward deployed troops. We have even Germany forward deploying troops in Europe. From your experience, we're in somewhat in a different place than we were when we first began to be aware that we needed to take decisive action to deter Russia. But from what you see now and where we started, what works? What doesn't? How do we keep our allies unified on making certain that they are prepared to see Russia as a threat and to work cooperatively with us so that they can be deterred?
Thanks, Mr. Turner, and thanks for always being so active with our European allies. Well, first of all, of course, it's American leadership. Even though throughout the history of the alliance, we've had disagreements and debates, serious debates with our closest allies, there never, ever was a question of America's commitment or of American leadership. So even our most strict allies or critics now still want and need American leadership. It doesn't need necessarily troops, American leadership and commitment. Second thing, what really works is the National Guard, the Army Reserve. Mr. Wilson referenced the state partnership program earlier. The state of Ohio, the state partnership program with Serbia, for example, is one of the best examples of where this works. And so the relationships that were built up over the past few decades with our board in the state partnership program is still paying off because of those relationships. And of course, thanks to the Congress support with the ERI and now EDI, we're able to fill critical gaps in capability with rotating National Guard reserve units. So those really, I think, are critical. I have to say that the congressional support is part of it. So even when allies are concerned about maybe what the administration has said, they turn back to the near unanimous support of Congress for America in the alliance.
Well, continuing with you, General, the 2% requirement, as Ms. Warmuth was discussing, is an agreement from our allies. It was agreed unanimously at the NATO summit in Wales. It's not the United States requirement. It is actually an agreement by the partners who are NATO members. This administration has made a significant push to require that each NATO member rise to that occasion. I've spoken to several parliamentarians who have found that pressure helpful. They report that in their own legislative branch, people used to say, why would we have to increase defense spending? We're in NATO. And now they're actually debating and saying we have to increase defense spending. We're in NATO. Do you see that political shift happening of the independent states having an understanding of a goal to increase defense spending, and do you see it translating into real additional capabilities for NATO?
Well, sir, for sure, I would say most members of the alliance are moving in the right direction. They will not all make 2% by the year 2024, that's for sure. And Germany in particular, it's inexcusable that Germany does not spend more. So I won't try to defend that at all. And certainly the administration's pressure has results. What I would say, though, is instead of just constantly clubbing people over the head about 2%, a much more sophisticated approach about what the alliance really needs, I think would be more helpful. When I was a lieutenant in Germany about 100 years ago, West Germany was a frontline state. We needed a huge Bundeswehr across the border from the huge Soviet forces. Today, the front line is about 1,000 kilometers to the east. We don't need a big Bundeswehr. We need more German trains, not more German tanks. Germany is the logistics hub, transport, we can move quickly. I think if we encourage Germany and the Netherlands to think in terms of improving transport, providing cyber protection.
I'm sorry, General, the gentleman's
defense.
I'm sorry, the gentleman's time has expired. Do you want to get on to the questioners? Apologize for that. It's awkward to communicate back and forth this way, but we do the best we can. Mr. Larson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question is for General Hodges. I think we've established that the role of allies and partners in U.S. military strategy and operations is important. I want to move to how. And for General Hodges, can you and have you thought through how you see Special Operations Command building partner capacity and its role being an effective tool in the future of our alliances and partnerships specific to great power competition?
Thanks, Mr. Larson. Sure. Special Operations Command Europe and also the NATO SOF headquarters in Mons both made significant impact on helping frontline states improve their, not only improve their own special forces. This is a very tight community throughout NATO and Eastern Europe inside the special forces, but also more and more nations are recognizing the importance of powerful resilience, the ability to resist disinformation as well as attack. This is an area where our special forces have been particularly helpful in strengthening resilience of nations along NATO's eastern flank. I would say you can never have too much forces, small numbers with big impact.
Thanks. Ms. Warmuth, the next question is for you. Have you thought through how you view SOCOM's global access and placement as a means to enable and support the DoD competitive advantage and achieve objectives as established in the NDS, again, specific to great power competition?
Thank you, Congressman. I would echo to some degree what General Hodges said. I think SOCOM is very focused on looking at how to adjust itself from the focus it's had very heavily on counterterrorism and counterinsurgency for the last 20 years to looking at the role of special operations forces in great power competition. And in particular, I think there's quite a bit that our special operations community can bring to bear in terms of gray zone competition, for example. So things like, just as General Hodges talked about the importance of building partner capacity and helping frontline states develop resistance forces. RAND did an excellent study just recently looking at what it would take to develop resistance forces in the Baltics, for example, and that's something that the Baltic countries could do at relatively little expense. I think it's really going to call on SOCOM to return to some degree to a greater focus on unconventional warfare, which is obviously, many of the hybrid threats and things that we did during the Cold War in sort of the gray areas in the shadows are relevant again, I think, in this area of great power competition.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Colby, a little bit different angle on the question about great power competition. The Brookings Institute did a report last October titled "Don't Make Us Choose," and it had to do with the Southeast Asian countries basically making the case, don't make us choose between China and the U.S. Your testimony really seems to run more counter to that. The idea being that these countries do have to make a choice. They are sovereign. They get to make a choice. How do you balance with the public comments from some of the countries who are saying, "Don't make us choose," to your very thoughtful view about how to attract them closer to the U.S.?
Well, thanks, sir, and I'll be brief here given your time. I would say that they don't want to choose between China and the United States, but really what we're asking them to do is choose between China and their own autonomy and sovereignty. And that's our interest, is in bolstering Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, as much as they can to defend themselves against Chinese military or other forms of coercion. It's not, I always use the analogy of John Foster Dulles, the so-called Pactomania of the 1950s, where everybody had to become a... As I think I mentioned in my testimony, we want to be very chary about extending an alliance commitment. There might be one or two we need to consider, but I think really what we want to do instead is empower them to defend their own independence and sovereignty.
That's excellent. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you very much, and really appreciate you ending that answer right as time expired. Mr. Lamborn, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to ask all three of you to comment on Iran. As you know, Russia and China are actively opposing U.S. efforts to put pressure on Iran. Western European allies are doing little or nothing. They're trying to evade sanctions to keep up commercial ties with Iran. We have some Middle Eastern growing relationships, especially with the Sunni Gulf states, and they've done the Abraham Accords with Israel, largely, I think, because of the Iranian threat. So we have some potential allies and partners in the Middle East, but we don't seem to have very good partners willing to step up when it comes to Western Europe. What should be, and I'm concerned if Joe Biden wins the election, we'll go back to the JCPOA program, which, in my opinion, does not prevent Iran from getting a bomb. It just delays it by a few years. So what should we do about Iran? I'd like to hear from all three of you. Ms. Warmuth, could you start, please? Then General Hodges, then Mr. Colby.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. Certainly, I would agree that Iran, continues to pose a serious threat for us, to our allies in the Middle East, and to some extent to our allies in Europe. So I think part of the problem that we've had in the last few years in terms of being able to find a common approach with our European partners, for example, towards Iran, I think the fact that some of the schisms that I talked about in my opening statement between our rhetoric about the importance of allies and partners and how we actually talk about allies and partners publicly and privately, that experience, for example, the Germans and how they've been treated, I think has made it harder for them to find common ground with the current administration in terms of how to deal with Iran. I think there's, in the European country representatives that I talk to, I think also are not as clear as they'd like to be on what do we want from Iran. Certainly the current administration has articulated the maximum pressure campaign, but in the minds of many European diplomats that I talk to, the kinds of things that the administration has asked Iran to do are not realistic. And so I think work needs to be done in articulating what is a sort of viable pathway that we can pursue to bring the Iranians back to the table. And I think Brian Hook at the State Department spent quite a lot of time working with the Europeans, and it sounded like had gotten close, but ultimately were not able to bring them together. So
thank you. Thank you. I'd like to hear from the other two also, but thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Hodges and then Mr. Colby.
Sir, thanks. 4 points. First of all, the pulling a bomb is not such a terrible thing. For sure, it's better if we can stop them, but if we delay for a few years, that's not necessarily bad. I regret that we've pulled out of the JCPOA, primarily because we now lose the opportunity or the vehicle with which we could be putting more pressure on European allies to keep the pressure on Iran. It's better if we lead instead of lead. Number 3, support for Iranian civil society. I think the administration, our government was pretty quiet after the execution of this Iranian wrestler, for example. We should be going out of our way to support Iranian civil society. Then finally, back to Turkey. Turkey is our bulwark against Iran.
Thank you. And Mr. Colby.
Thanks, Congressman. Well, I think your point about the Abraham Accords coalition in the region is the point I'd like to stress that I think is really where the future lies, which is, in a sense, it's almost a perfect example of the shared threat driving, traditionally strange bedfellows together, but now we have them on the White House lawn, I think, if I'm mistaken. I think that's the real way to build going forward, and obviously we've got to maintain a significant degree of pressure on Iran to respect our interests and those of our regional allies and partners like Israel and the Gulf states. But I think this is what we really want to empower, especially because we will not be able to allocate the degree of attention and resources to CENTCOM that we have in the past. Really, one of the core areas of the NDS was not just the Middle East, but having a lighter footprint, a more economical footprint, and doing by, with, and through, and working with partners. And I think this political breakthrough hopefully will enable us to do so in a more sort of efficient and force multiplying way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney is recognized for 5 minutes. I think you're still muted there, Joe. In fact, I know you're still muted. There we go. And yet we still cannot hear you. You unmuted yourself, but I'm not. How are we doing? Yeah, we can't hear you. I'm sorry. We'll try to get that fixed and come back to you shortly. You're unmuted, but for some reason it's not coming through. So we'll work on that, and we'll go to Mr. Garamendi for 5 minutes. Sorry about that, Joe. We'll try to get it fixed. One other thing, sorry. This is awkward, I know, but as you're asking it, once you've asked your question, it's better for the member to then mute their microphone while they're listening to the answer, because we get feedback if you don't. I know then you got to turn it back on when you talk again, but if you could do that on and off thing, it would help reduce the feedback. And with that, Mr. Garamendi is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to the witnesses, thank you for very interesting and useful and important presentations. Out in the West, in the technology community, we often talk about disruptive technologies. We've certainly, over the last 4 years, had a very disruptive leadership, one in which there's been a very significant change from America working with its allies to a philosophy of America first. We will have another leader, perhaps, or the same leader. My question really goes to the large question of the philosophy that we should proceed with in the next 4 years. Either changing President Trump's philosophy from America first to another philosophy, or a Biden philosophy. And just on the large scale of things, should it be America first and the allies not so much to worry about, or should we be looking at partnerships and making our foreign and military partners and trade policies about partnerships? Just in a large scope. Let's start with Ms. Warmuth and then go Hodges, and from there.
Thank you, Congressman. I'll try to be brief. I think all of us at the witness table and many of you have spoken to the importance and the value that alliances and partnerships bring to the security of the United States. So I think that those alliances need to remain at the center of our national security strategy, regardless of who is elected this fall. And, if President Trump remains in the White House, I wouldn't expect him to dramatically change his approach. But I think what I would emphasize is the importance, again, of that consistent messaging and consistent and reliable communications. I think some of the things that President Trump wants to achieve have been made more difficult by the disruptive communication style. But again, there's been a bipartisan tradition of alliances and partnerships being valuable to the U.S., and I think it made sense in the past. It makes sense going forward.
Thank you. General Hodges.
Sir, yes, sir. Thank you. So one of the things that has been so helpful is the consistent support by the Congress for the alliance and for working with our allies. Our allies understand, by and large, the American political system. They understand that presidents and administrations change. So having the consistent support from the Congress has really been important. And I hope that this will certainly continue.
Congressman, I would say that, I think what we want in our overall approach is one of enlightened self-interest. And in fact, I would say alliances or partnerships are necessary if you're going to put America's interests first. I mean, I think I'm not being cute, but actually the way to achieve the interests of the American people is to have these alliances and partnerships, but make sure they work. And a good friend and a predecessor of mine, Jim Thomas, put it well, I think, a while ago when he said we need to change our traditional alliances from protectorates to partnerships. As I think General Hodges was indicating, in some ways our traditional partnerships had the aspect of protectorates because particularly after World War II, we were half of global GDP. That just isn't the case anymore. So I actually think friction is good and valuable if it is deliberate and intentional and achieving the results we want, which is a more equitable coalition that is adjusting to the reality that what we and our traditional allies have to offer is not enough to outweigh China and what it's able to do in Iran and Russia and terrorists. So I think, we have to adapt, and that is going to result in friction. I think, the CEO, as I saw in the press, just downgraded its projections of the American economic growth over time. As Warmuth rightly pointed out, we are going to see pressure on the defense budget. We have to, I actually think this could be a warning signal. This is sort of a flare. I say this to the Japanese, for instance, and the Germans a lot, is this is going to come due at some point, and Americans are ultimately, you would know better than I, are going to say something isn't right here. So we need to have more equity and something more balanced, but making the whole thing work together better as the goal.
My time's expired, and I thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bacon is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the panel for great discussion. And what I'm hearing is what conforms a little bit to my perspective, that America is the indispensable nation. It's indispensable to freedom, rule of law, human rights, free and fair trade, but we can't do it alone. I think that's what I'm hearing as well. China's GDP is matching ours soon. We also have Russia that's spending much above our level of GDP. And then, of course, we got Iran and still terrorism. My question is really my first question is to Mrs. Warmuth and Mr. Colby. I did serve 30 years in the Air Force. I did a lot with NATO. Can we try to do something similar again in the Pacific? Can we find a structure that better integrates ourselves with Japan and Australia, New Zealand, and other countries like we had with CETO 30 years ago? Should we try to pursue something along these lines?
Thank you, Congressman. My sense is that it would be difficult to establish a NATO or CETO-like formal alliance with the countries that you mentioned in Asia, but we do have already alliance mechanisms with Japan, Australia, South Korea. We have ASEAN, and I think there are pieces to build on that are substantial. The challenge is that many of the countries in the Indo-Pacific don't want to have to choose between the United States and China. They want to engage with China for very clear economic interests, while most of them lean towards the United States for security interests. And I think they're trying to sort of thread that needle. I think it would make it difficult because of that to establish a formal relationship. But I think there's much more we can do, and Mr. Colby has spoken to it eloquently, and that's really where we need to be focusing with DOD and the State Department in the next 10 years.
Thanks, Congressman. Just building on what Ms. Warmuth, I think, rightly said about the difficulty of forming it. So given that, I think it's better to use our political capital on that front to push for increased defense spending, posture enhancements and integration, and other kinds of preparation for a shared effort. And I think one of the key reasons why we don't need to push so hard is I think when you look at it practically, what we need from each individual country is more its own self-defense, with I think the single exception of Australia, which is more of a collective defense model, and I commend them in their defense strategic update over their winter, our summer. But really, Japan needs to focus primarily on its own defense, Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam, Philippines, et cetera. So actually, NATO wouldn't really get us that much because we're not going to be asking too much of the allies to do for each other. So again, I'd rather spend that political capital on things that would actually contribute more to deterrence and defense in the region against China.
Well, thank you for your perspective. My concern is we have a lot of bilateral relationships there. If we had a little more multilateral and a little more integration, it may be more effective. My next question is to General Hodges. I appreciate your perspective, sir, on how we can better deter in the Baltics. What more can we do to help preserve these countries that are way on the front line and vulnerable. Would it help to have a U.S. flagged unit permanently there, such as like a air defense unit? Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Bacon. Actually, we don't need to have that. I think the alliance has done a very good job responding to the threat in the Baltic region. We probably are better there than anywhere else in the alliance. I would favor maybe improving the transportation logistics infrastructure there to facilitate rapid reinforcement. But I think in the Baltic region, we're in a good place. Kaliningrad is a liability for the Kremlin. With the geography is in our favor in the Baltic Sea. So keep what we're doing, maybe improve some logistics capability, transportation capability up there. The Black Sea is where we're on the wrong side of the equation.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. We will give Mr. Courtney another try. Is he up on the screen there? Yeah, we don't seem to be making progress on that front. So we'll go to Ms. Gabbard.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for speaking here today. I want to bring the conversation back to Turkey. Hope to hear from Hodges, Ms. Warmuth. Sorry?
Go ahead.
Congressman Gabbard, yes. Did you want me to address?
Thank you. In earlier comments, General Hodges talked about some of the issues with Turkey, one of which is the kind of arbitrary drawing of the line between CENTCOM and EUCOM there between Turkey and Syria, and perhaps some differences between the commands on priorities in the region, which drove some of the decisions being made. I was surprised, though, to hear you kind of the takeaway being that the United States needs to rebuild or earn back Turkey's trust and confidence rather than the other way around. When you look at the laundry list of things that Turkey has done and is continuing to do, not only that undermine U.S. objectives, but also undermine NATO objectives, with what's happening in the Mediterranean now, in conflicts and issues they've had with Greece and France and so forth. You mentioned, General Hodges, about Turkey needs to be held accountable. What needs to be done to do that? And then when you're finished, I'll ask Ms. Warmuth to answer the same question.
Thank you, Congresswoman Gabbard. This is very difficult, and I don't have a ready solution for many of these challenges. My point is that if we think strategically, we've got to figure out how do we keep Turkey on the side. For sure, this trust is a two-way thing. I certainly do not mean to imply that the burden is on us to regain their trust, and I don't condone much of what the Erdogan administration has done or said. My point is to think long-term, and fortunately, we have not done something that causes long-term damage on our side for this relationship. I think we work with countries and allies around the world where we're not happy with the policies that they have about certain things, but we manage to keep that compartmented so that we can focus on our security, and our security is better when we're able to have radar, air bases in Turkey, and that Turkey controls the straits out of the Black Sea. That all is our advantage.
Thank you, General Hodges. I think that one of the main issues that I have is that among the differences we have with Turkey policies, they're not limited to their domestic policies or their interaction with other countries. We've seen Turkish indirect fire on our troops at known American locations within northern Syria. And really, there's no recourse. Turkey acts with impunity as they have for so long. And I've been asking these questions for a long time in Congress, and I am generally, responded to with a shrug of the shoulders, like, well, we need the basic thing is we need them more than they need us, and so Turkey feels like they can do whatever they want. And Ms. Warmuth, I wonder if you can weigh in on this about some constructive actions either the United States or NATO can take to make it so that Turkey is not in a position of acting without any consequence whatsoever.
Well, Congresswoman, as General Hodges said, there is not a, I'm a big fan of The Sound of Music. How do you solve a problem like Maria? Turkey is a very challenging geostrategic problem. I was in the Obama administration when we were fighting ISIS, and we knew there was tension between the necessity to have partners on the ground, and the Syrian Democratic Forces were what we had. We knew Turkey had issues with that. In my experience, however, the United States worked very hard and very closely with Turkey to try to assuage their concerns, and nothing was ever enough for them. So we do have a challenge. They are very important in terms of where they are located, but the authoritarianism that Erdogan has turned to is concerning. So I think we have to keep the dialogue open and, continue to try to keep Turkey inside the fold, but at the same time communicate that doing whatever they want is not acceptable. And the S-400, for example, is a key example of that.
The gentlelady's time has expired. Thank you. Ms. Hartzler is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I remain deeply concerned about China's growing economic and military footprint in Africa and our ability to adequately counter those activities. China is promoting not just the Belt and Road Initiative, but also its party army model through training and education initiatives with African militaries. So, Ms. Warmuth, how can the Department of Defense better utilize security cooperation authorities to build partner capacity so our partners in Africa understand the risk of doing business with China? And is there a way to successfully counter China's debt trap diplomacy and military presence in Africa, especially in countries with a history of corruption? And finally, what more should the Department of Defense be doing to counter this threat?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Well, first, I think AFRICOM's zero-based review, I hope, will shed light on which kinds of activities are helping us and helping our African partners. There's a lot you can do with building partner capacity, but as Mr. Colby and others have indicated, we are going to have to make some hard choices. So I think we have to look at where are we getting the most bang for the buck with the work we're doing with the Africans. I think the security assistance programs we have are a valuable tool, and a lot of what I see China doing in Africa is frankly quite self-serving and exploitative. And I think many African companies, or countries rather, see that. So the work we do with them isn't just about us being extractive, it helps them. So I think we should continue to do that, but be judicious in our choices.
Great. Thank you. Lieutenant General Hodges, in your testimony, you talk about the importance of U.S. leadership in resolving the rising tension between Greece and Turkey in Eastern Mediterranean. In your opinion, what can the United States do to resolve this conflict between two NATO allies that have a history of tensions? And what role does the Department of Defense play in easing tensions between these two nations?
Congresswoman Hartzler, thank you. If I may reference Africa,
sure.
Working with our allies, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, all have extensive efforts going on in Africa. So there's an opportunity, once again, where we can work with allies to achieve what our objectives are. When it comes to Greece and Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean, I think that the State Department's guidance to its diplomats in the region has been to keep Germany in front, let Germany be the lead diplomatic effort here. I think, frankly, the United States in the past would have been the one to do this, to get these allies together, as we've had to do numerous times in the past. But we've got to find a way, with these two nations in particular, find a way for them to back down, to climb back down from where they are. I think at the end of the day, for Turkey, it's about economic relationships with the European Union. Perhaps Germany could find a way to offer Turkey some sort of a trade union with the EU as a return for them backing down. Greece, of course, is under massive pressure from the refugees that are coming across the Mediterranean, and they're kind of the entry point, them and Italy, for all the refugees coming to Europe. Finding a way to help them would also be a part of this. Most of these refugees would not be coming across if it was not for Russian support of the Assad regime in Syria or support for General Haftar in Libya.
Do you think Germany is doing enough to be aggressive and in reaching out and trying to resolve this issue?
I can't tell for sure. I've spoken with our ambassador in Greece, one of the best diplomats I've ever met, Ambassador Jeff Pyatt. He says that the Germans are working hard there, but I don't think that they're approaching it in the way that maybe a senior American diplomat who had the responsibility for doing it might be able to do that.
Okay. Last topic here, Lieutenant General Hodges. The Armed Services has made great strides in providing expanded victim services for sexual harassment, assault response, and prevention. But I am curious if service members who are stationed or deployed overseas are afforded the same level of resources as service members stationed in the United States. I have an open constituent issue on this right now as it relates to Poland. And so based on your previous experience as Commander of U.S. Army Europe, what should the Department of Defense, along with the State Department, do working with our allies to ensure U.S. military victims of sexual assault in host nations are provided adequate resources? And do you think we should be doing a better job?
Unfortunately, the gentlelady's time has expired. We'll have to take that for the record. It's a fairly important question, but I would love to get your perspectives to Ms. Hartzler and the committee on that. Gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Gallego is recognized for 5 minutes. You with us there, Ruben? You still got the little mute sign in front of you there.
Thank you. I apologize. It's always difficult when you're trying to do these events.
We got you now. Go ahead.
So thank you. Okay, so a few questions that. Thank you again. This has been a great discussion so far. I guess in terms of our kind of further going down the rabbit hole with Turkey to begin with, if Turkey isn't part of NATO and we can't rely on Turkey's ability to field the large, because they are the largest infantry in the European theater right now for us in terms of should something ever happen with when the balloon goes up and we would need their assistance. If we can't necessarily rely on NATO, then where are we going to find the kind of mass that they provide right now? And I apologize if we can start with Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, and then Christine, and then Mr. Colby.
Thank you, sir. Well, for sure, Turkey brings a lot of military capability, air, land, and forces to the alliance. And that, if for some reason they were no longer in NATO, that would be a gap that would have to be filled by us or the UK or other allies. So that's a problem right from the start. But more importantly is control of the straits that connect the Black Sea to the Eastern Mediterranean. And so having a NATO ally that has control and sovereignty over the strait via the Montreux Convention, that's what.
I'm sorry, we seem to have lost the general there. If you want to move on to somebody else to answer the question.
Ms. Warmuth? So you're muted, Ms. Warmuth.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now.
Yes. Perfect.
I think, the size of the Turkish military is just one reason why we need to continue to work hard, as challenging as Turkey is, to keep them in the alliance. Certainly if they were outside the alliance, the U.S. has a very large ground force, but we don't want to have to go there. And as General Hodges said, we need them from a maritime dimension. We need them in terms of just the geostrategic bridge they are between Europe and the Middle East. So it's all of those reasons why I think we have to keep, working very hard on these tough problems. I wish we had better answers, but I think we just have to keep grinding away on it.
Mr. Colby.
Thanks, Congressman. I don't really have anything to add to what's already been said. If you had questions.
And I guess kind of a deeper dive question. I was earlier on a call with members of the Bundestag as part of the German Marshall Fund, and I do have conversations with a lot of European defense ministers, both NATO and non-NATO allies. But there is a sentiment that I keep hearing that though Congress is very affirmative in our NATO responsibilities and the fact that we would back up Article 5, there is a sentiment that is still felt out there that, the Trump administration itself is not, a long-term ally when it comes to NATO. So I guess this conversation goes to, first we'll go back to General Hodges. Have you heard of that sentiment, and how deeply is it taking root that, there's some doubt of whether we would uphold our NATO commitments?
Well, sir, the fact that we even have to have this discussion tells you the significance of it. And I never imagined we would ever be in the place where allies would wonder whether or not the United States would ever be there, or that the president, any president, would question Article 5. Certainly not in a public way like that.
Ms. Warmuth, do you have anything to add?
There is very significant concern, I think, in the conversations I have with folks from Germany, whether in the diplomatic corps or elsewhere, as well as European countries. And I think that's why you see what I would call hedging behavior to some degree when you've got Macron talking about a European army, for example. While, I think that would be a difficult undertaking, it's reflective of the concerns they have about our commitment right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Whitman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses today. I'd like to acknowledge the importance that you all pointed out to our partnerships and our alliances. And I'd like to go to the National Defense Strategy that talked about how do we actually look at ways to improve those alliances, especially getting them to the point where we can put them into extended networks to make sure that we have the ability to take decisive action, make sure we are able to deter. And there are 3 elements in the plan that are of particular interest. The first item says upholding a foundation of mutual respect, responsibility, priorities, and accountability. Number 2, expanding regional consultative mechanisms and collaborative planning. And number 3, deepening interoperability. And I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about items number 2 and 3. As we develop our operational plans, it doesn't seem like to me that we go in depth with our allies and partners here. We're going to rely on, especially if there's a major conflict. Now, I understand that those operational plans are classified, but I worry that we don't involve folks at that level. And I want to make sure, too, we understand what our allies can do, because that drives decisions in what we need to do in the budgeting side, what we need to do in the policy side, especially in developing the NDAA each year. I want to make sure, too, that we understand. It seems like to me that there's a lack of network architecture and communications to be able to do the interoperability that we need to do. In fact, it was highlighted to me. I went to a RIMPAC exercise, and I was on board an Australian ship, and I'll never forget an Australian brigadier coming out just flaming mad that he couldn't communicate with other folks in the exercise through the radio. So he was on his cell phone, communicating to allies and partners in that exercise. It just goes to show some of the concerns. And I wanted to ask this question: what are the concrete steps that the United States military can take to make sure we have the interoperability, the technology, to where we can not just say in concept that we have these relationships, and not just that we practice them a few times a year and then see the problems, but how do we get the deep and meaningful interoperability that we need with our allies and partners if we find ourselves in a high-level conflict? And I argue it's also incredibly important on the deterrence side. So, Mr. Colby, can you give me your perspective on that?
Well, Congressman, I think you put your finger right on it. I mean, I think this whole idea, I mean, interoperability is important. Obviously, the capability to operate together, the phone example is really striking. But as I mentioned in my testimony, I think we want to try to lean on the, for instance, forced development. I think Ms. Warmuth may have started this. It started under the last administration. But doing much more aligned forced development plans with, for instance, the UK. I think we could move forward on that with the Australians. I think we do have to be cautious, and that's where a lot of this reluctance comes from, is you don't know who's going to be there in the event that the balloon goes up, as Congressman Gallego said. But I think we, given, for instance, where the Australians are going, given what the Japanese have indicated, I think we can't afford to be redundant. So a much deeper integration and alignment in posture, in operational planning. There are ways to build in uncertainty, but I think we should be prepared to take more risk, because I think on the other side we will get more efficacy if we plan in a more integrated fashion.
I'd like to bring up one other point, too. I've heard from diplomatic and military leaders that have been involved in ASEAN about their concern about corruption. We hear Chinese officials paying officials at the ASEAN to be able to speak before the United States. And it seems like to me this is emblematic of a deeper-seated problem that we have with the Chinese clearly trying to take advantage through corruption in these processes. I wanted to ask, what do you think the United States can do to combat this level of corruption, which seems to be growing into more systematic or systemic corruption within ASEAN, and what China does, not just in the Asia-Pacific, but around the world? So, Mr. Colby, I'd like to get your perspective on that.
Great. Thanks, Congressman. Well, I think this is one of the areas where we can use our values in our own advantage, we and the Europeans, the Japanese, which is to say that we stand for long-term accountability, the rule of law and this kind of thing. I don't think we're going to be able to match every Chinese renminbi that they're going to throw around, but people in the region, if they are not put under the really coercive shadow of Chinese power and have to swallow Chinese hegemony, they will eventually see which is the better course to take, and I think that's where we want to be. Things like DFC, Act are valuable, but also our legal code and values.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Carbajal, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for participating today. I want to take a minute to discuss New START, which is set to expire in February 2021 without further action by the administration. I know this hearing is about our alliances, but the treaty is important in this conversation. While I understand the administration believes that they can negotiate a trilateral deal that includes China, my concern is that why would we put ourselves in a situation where we have no arms control agreement in place, especially with the U.S. withdrawing from the INF treaty in 2019? Our allies clearly see the value of the treaty, and NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg has urged the United States to extend the agreement in order to provide the necessary time to pursue a new deal. To all the witnesses, starting with Ms. Warmuth, do you think it is in the best interest of the United States and our allies to allow New START to expire without a new agreement in place?
No, Congressman. I very much believe that it is in our interest to basically refresh New START and extend it. And exactly as you said, spend that time then working with the Russians to bring in their hypersonic weapons, the other, nuclear torpedoes, et cetera, as well as their non-strategic nuclear weapons into a treaty framework. And we could certainly continue during that time to try to engage the Chinese in conversations about their nuclear policy and their nuclear programs. But I think it would be a negative development for the U.S. if we let New START lapse.
Thank you. General Hodges?
Thanks, sir. I also think it would be a mistake to not extend New START while we continue to work on refreshing it. But this is a place where we need allies. I think Germany is probably the only country in Europe that can actually influence Kremlin behavior. So we should be working with allies and put pressure on Kremlin to achieve this.
Thank you. Mr. Colby?
Thanks, Congressman. I think the New START treaty, while it has perfections, a solid basis for strategic arms control. It's based primarily, almost entirely derived from the framework, which was negotiated by President Reagan and then President Bush in early 90s. And we'd be, better off with something like New START than.
Thank you. I think we lost you. I'll proceed to my next question. Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Thornberry both touched on a topic I want to discuss further, which is how do we balance security needs with political objectives when dealing with partner countries that have documented human rights violations and authoritarian leaders. Ms. Warmuth, how can the Department of Defense be further utilized as part of the whole of government strategy to promote human rights and democratic values among partner countries?
Well, I think one of the most important contributions the Department of Defense makes is leading by example in terms of demonstrating adherence to the rule of law and demonstrating the importance of human rights. And, in all of our security assistance programs, for example, building partner capacity, we include in the curricula courses on the rule of law and the importance of human rights. And we have things like the Leahy Law, which we discussed earlier, that, keeps us from operating with foreign country units that are abusing human rights. I think that's the most important contribution DOD makes. There's a lot of action that needs to happen on the State Department side, but that's where I think DOD has a role.
Thank you. Mr. Colby, with regards to whether there is a U.S. interest in having U.S. troops present in South Korea, President Trump has previously said, quote, "It can be debated, I can go either way," unquote, end quote. Do you believe it is in the U.S. national security interest to maintain a presence in South Korea? And can you speak to the benefits of our forward posture in South Korea?
Thanks, Congressman. I think our posture and our alliance with South Korea makes a lot of sense. It's very valuable. We will need a presence there. It does need to adapt in light of the overriding importance on China going forward, and it needs to be equitable. I'd also just like to say, sir, that what I said at the end was that New START, while an imperfect agreement, is better than nothing at all. It's a solid basis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gallagher is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we're talking about the role of allies in strategy. Strategy is often difficult because it requires us to prioritize between what is essential and what is extraneous and identify, if nothing else, what are the strong points for geopolitical competition. It seems obvious to me, both geographically and geopolitically, that there's perhaps no more strategically important piece of terrain right now in Indo-PACOM than Taiwan. So my question for Mr. Colby is, what are your views on our current policy of strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan and whether we need to rethink that policy and perhaps clarify it?
Thanks, Congressman. I fully agree with you, and I know you've been leading the discussion on this. I'll say I think we should move towards a more clarity on our position. I do think under TRA and the 6 assurances, we already are effectively committed, but I think we run into a danger of a Korea 1950 situation. Ambiguity is tremendously perilous when the other side has the capability to do something about it, the desire, and may think he can get away with it, as happened in 1950. And I think that is our danger today. And we are, Taiwan is valuable militarily in its placement in the first island chain, because our credibility is already in the line. Ask any of the people who talk to the Asian partners, and everybody thinks it's the canary in the coal mine or the what have you. And then third, its status as a liberal democracy. So I think moving towards a clarification consistent with our one China policy makes a lot of sense. And I do think it's beginning to have more and more support. It's definitely partisan. I'd commend Richard Haas's piece in Foreign Affairs recently. I think that clarity would be safer in a way that is judicious and prudent diplomatically with Beijing.
Thank you. Maybe I'll follow up with you, Mr. Colby, on a different region of the world, Europe. Obviously, there have been those on this committee, myself included, who have asked the White House for clarification on what exactly it intends to do with troop reductions in Germany. You've been an outspoken, I don't know if critic is too harsh a word, but certainly pointed to the fact that there is more that Germany can be doing. I'd just be curious to get your views on on any proposed troop production in Germany and your broader views on the way we can encourage our German allies to make more substantial commitments to the NATO alliance in light of Russian aggression.
Well, thanks, Congressman. I think your and your colleagues' questions are important and they deserve answers. I mean, based on what Secretary Esper and General Hyten and General Walters said in July, this is an ongoing discussion, so we'll see what it's like. They did say it's consistent with the National Defense Strategy designed to deal with a secondary threat from Russia and Europe, but over time making us more, as you rightly said, I think, sir, prioritizing Asia. I'd also like to put the Germany discussion really in perspective and say that this friction, we can talk about whether each move or the overall tone is appropriate, but we do need to look at this in a couple of ways. One, this friction is not new. I mean, President Johnson in the balance of payments crisis literally insisted on payment from Germany in order to retain the stationing of U.S. troops in West Germany at the time. And of course, the Congress, as I understand, passed the Mansfield Amendment, I believe, which was calling for the wholesale withdrawal of U.S. troops from Europe. So we have been through this before. In the case of Korea, President Carter was going to remove all forces from the peninsula. So, and actually burden sharing issues, I'd say, were more intense, but also more candid, and I think more realistic during the Cold War. The other thing I'd say about Germany is let's take them at their word. They say they are committed to the multilateral, rules-based order. Nobody has benefited more from NATO and the post-war order than Germany itself. Of course, there's the sad history before that. But as General Hodges indicated, the Bundeswehr of the Cold War after 1955 was the most capable European military in NATO, and in some ways, and I defer to him, maybe more capable than the American army in Europe at some points. In 1988, the West German military had 12 active divisions on the inter-German border. That's a Germany 2/3 the size of the current Federal Republic. I don't think they can put one, certainly not two divisions together today. And I disagree with General Hodges, and with all due respect. If we are going to contribute more and more to Asia, and we have to focus on it given China's scale and scope, that means Germany does have to play a role, and that does involve German tanks and German artillery and German tactical aviation as part of NATO, of course. But I mean, honestly, I'm befuddled with Germany. I'm actually a big fan of Germany. Like Congressman Gallego, I've done things with the German Marshall Front, Atlantic Brücke. I go there at least once a year. But I don't understand, because on the one hand, it's either a bit obtuse and it smacks of hypocrisy that nobody's benefited more than they, or on the other hand, it looks quite cynical, honestly. And I refuse to believe the Germans are so cynical. So I think they really should meet their obligations as they claim to want to do.
Thank you. The time has expired.
Mr. Cisneros is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists for being here today, or being here virtually, I should say. As demonstrated by the COVID-19 pandemic, infectious diseases know no border, and global health crisis are a matter of national security. In turn, it is imperative that we work directly with the global community to improve pandemic preparedness at home and abroad, including through initiatives like the Global Health Security Agenda, a network of 69 countries working to coordinate on global health issues. How can we elevate global health security as a key component of our bilateral and multilateral security relationships? And how should the military work with our diplomats and development professionals to ensure we can address the national security threat with all the tools in our toolbox? Ms. Warmuth, you want to go ahead first?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. Thank you very much. That's an issue I care a lot about, and I think we do. Before this pandemic happened, I was absolutely a proponent of arguing that we should pay more attention to global health security challenges and invest more as a country in our own public health infrastructure, as well as helping other countries around the world do that. Our military has some pretty impressive health surveillance capabilities, some pretty impressive response capabilities that are relevant to global health challenges. So I think that our Defense Department has quite a bit to offer, but really the center of gravity needs to be in the development side of things, I would argue, and revitalizing, for example, many of the programs that were started as part of the Global Health Security Agenda, and going back and allocating more to the other departments in our federal government that have an important role to play, like the CDC, like Health and Human Services, for example, and like USAID.
Thank you for that. So President Trump frequently discusses our overseas force posture in terms of financial costs without discussing the benefit to U.S. national security. What are the benefits to U.S. national security for having U.S. forces forward deployed in the Indo-Pacific, and what risk would we incur if our posture was reduced? What challenges do the domestic political environment in the United States for alliance management? And what about the domestic political environment within our nation allies? Mr. Colby, would you mind taking a shot at that question?
Sure, Congressman. I mean, broadly, I agree with your point that a forward, forward presence in the particularly the Western Pacific is very valuable. I mean, I think it's dependent. I mean, we do need to adapt that forward presence. It needs to become credible, which means designed to deny China its ability to, particularly to take over or subordinate a country like Taiwan or eventually South Korea or the Philippines. But as I said, I think earlier, I mean, the way it seems to me to make it to America first is to do it alongside allies and partners. And that's not, I don't mean that in a sort of, kumbaya sort of way. I mean, to be totally candid, I think they're more akin to business partnerships than friendships. But in business partnerships, you also have to have candid conversations. You have to re-baseline what things are. But I'm optimistic that we're going to, maybe if for no other reason than the countries of Asia, they recognize they need the United States. And one of the things the administration has really done that I think is lasting and important is made very clear that the United States has a keen sense of the challenge posed by China and what's going to be entailed to confront that challenge over the long haul.
General Hodges, do you want to take a shot at that question too?
Sure, thanks. This is all about access. Without having allies and forward basing, we can't get there. You can't defend America just from Fort Hood, Texas, or from Norfolk Naval Air Station or Camp Pendleton. So, and with very small numbers, if you think about 60,000 American Army and Air Force and Navy that are in Europe, 60,000, that's barely over half of the stadium that the University of Michigan football team plays in. So a very small investment, yet gets us access. And same with the Republic of Korea. I spent a year there. It gives us the chance to part what Secretary Carter used to call horizontal escalation. If China does something against Taiwan, we're in a position to strike China somewhere else. So these bases and the alliances that we have, the partnerships, give us multiple options. It's an important part of deterrence.
Thank you all for those answers. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Ms. Houlihan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first one, I believe, would be most likely for Ms. Warmuth. During World War II, Allied forces cooperated extensively in the development and manufacturing of new and existing technologies to support military operations and intelligence gathering during the war. We've continued that tradition with many of our allies and partners just ongoing to today. And as we look at today's modern warfare, evolving warfare strategies, specifically in the realm of cyber and AI, I believe that it still is beneficial to the U.S. to share or collaborate on technological ideas or plans with our allies or partner nations. Can you comment on what do you see as the barriers to improving the responsible collaboration with allies on new technologies?
Sure, Congresswoman, thank you for that question. Certainly, I agree that cooperating with our allies and partners on technology issues is an important thing that we should be doing. In the cyber domain, for example, we have a NATO Center of Excellence in the Baltics, for example. I think one of the most important things we can do is along the lines of something that Mr. Colby brought up earlier, which is to, in our planning processes, in our force development processes, to have much more robust and detailed dialogues with some of our closest partners, like the UK, for example, in Europe, or Australia, Japan in the Indo-Pacific, for example. And not only should we be talking to them about sort of what traditional conventional capabilities they can bring to bear in a potential warfight, we need to be talking with them about AI, about cyber technologies, and in many cases those countries are quite innovative. So that is an area I think we should work on. The barriers, of course, are the sort of ones we traditionally encounter in technology transfer areas, which is we, of course, have to be concerned about protecting our intellectual property. We have to be confident that our allies are going to protect any sensitive technologies that we grant them access to. But that's something that, we sort of have a number of mechanisms to work through and a number of agencies who help us with that. There are barriers, but I think we could probably take a little bit more risk given the gravity of the challenges we're facing today.
Thank you. And General and Mr. Colby, do you have anything to add to that?
Congresswoman Houlihan, three things. First of all, key to effective deterrence is rapidly identifying what's happening to recognize what the Kremlin or what the Chinese might be up to. And that's going to require intelligence sharing at the speed of light. It won't be an American satellite that first detects the threat. It's going to be something else. So being able to knock down the walls that prevent information and intelligence sharing is going to be very important. Secondly, the infrastructure. We depend so much on transportation infrastructure, airports, seaports around the world to do what we do. If those are not protected from cyber strike, then it's the same thing as if somebody launched Iskander missiles at the port of Bremerhaven. So investing in cyber protection, working with allies there. And then third, it's a specific example, but I think it's illustrative. I'm an infantry soldier, but I have grown to appreciate what maritime unmanned systems, Navy drones, how valuable those are. And the United States is leading in this field, sharing that with our allies in the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. It is so much more cost effective for them to complement the surface vessels that they have and would significantly change the balance of power in the Black Sea, for example, against the Black Sea Fleet.
That's excellent, and thank you. And Mr. Colby, do you have anything to add?
Thanks, Congresswoman. Building on Ms. Warmuth's comments, with which I associate myself closely, I think that's right, that we need to take more risk. I think this is an example of an area where, to use the academic kind of term, unipolarity has really kind of put deep roots into the American defense establishment's mindset, which is to say, I think candidly, when we think about a lot of planning and the way the American defense system went about things, allies were nice, but a lot of it was symbolic, with maybe the exception of the Brits and the Australians. And I think what we need to go back to is more of a Cold War model. Cold War is always a dangerous analogy. I don't mean this writ large. But I mean in the sense that I think during the Cold War, the great example, there was an American division and then a German division, an American division, a Belgian division, and so forth. And that, that involved risk. Who knows if it would have held up as well as the Germans or the Americans. But I think we do need to lean forward, because you leave a lot of value on the table if you are too protective.
Thank you. I've run out of time and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Crow is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all of you for joining this great discussion. And General Hodges, good to see you virtually. I know it's late where you are. I would like to start with Ms. Warmuth and Mr. Colby. The administration has announced a pretty drastic withdrawal and rapid withdrawal of our forces from Afghanistan. We have about 12,000 troops as part of the Resolute Support Mission overall. About 5,000 of those or so are NATO partners. And indeed, the only time when Article 5 in the history of NATO has been invoked was after 9/11, when our NATO partners came to our aid. So very briefly, I'd like to hear from Ms. Warmuth and Mr. Colby what the impact on that alliance would be and the message it would send if we were to withdraw without sufficient coordination and consultation with our allies who are there fulfilling their responsibilities to us under Article 5. Ms. Warmuth, do you want to begin?
Clearly, we need to, yes, I hope I'm unmuted. Clearly, we need to work closely with our allies who are still with us in Afghanistan to coordinate any kind of significant withdrawal. And certainly, we are clearly in a process of drawing down there. As you know, several of our NATO allies have served, importantly as framework nations. Many of them are still with us there. And for a long time, our philosophy has been, in together, out together. So I think as we work through the final details of what the ultimate shape and composition of any continuing presence might be in Afghanistan, we're going to have to work closely with our allies to make sure that it is a coordinated effort and that everyone understands where we are trying to go and how we're going to get there together.
And are you seeing that happening or hearing that? Because I am not. I'm not hearing that we're going through that process.
I have not been following the discussions in Afghanistan around that very closely, but certainly we are not communicating generally as much as I think we need to be on a whole range of issues, whether it's the withdrawal of 12,000 folks from Germany or whether it's the details of how we're going to get out of Afghanistan.
Mr. Colby, I'm going to skip you because I want to get to General Hodges for a question given my time constraints. General, the European Deterrence Initiative was passed in 2014 as a way to rebolster our defenses and show our commitment to our NATO partners and others in Europe. The administration now has, for 2 consecutive years, reduced that budget and even shifted funds away from critical infrastructure and logistics investments. What has the impact been of those reductions on our alliances and the perception of our allies' commitment to the Russian aggression issue?
Well, Mr. Crow, thank you. First of all, the European Reassurance Initiative and then the European Deterrence Initiative, Defense Initiative, we considered it when I was in U.S. Army Europe as oxygen. Without that, you could not get the rotational forces, both active and even more importantly, the Guard and Reserve. You couldn't get them in the quantity and the frequency that we needed. So those funds were extremely important for that. And also, of course, for improving infrastructure along NATO's eastern flank that we needed. And so as allies see that this is decreasing without some sort of explanation, they begin to associate that with, okay, is this part of the U.S. shifting away or pivoting to the Pacific? Are we losing interest? So the money as well as the troops are the 2 biggest signals that they follow.
Thank you, General. And then very briefly, also, General Hodges, there's the 2% GDP requirement, but also there's the 20% major equipment requirement. But I'm hearing from our allies that 20% requirement should be re-examined because many of our partners there actually don't even have the personnel and the logistics to support additional major equipment purchases, the Belgians being one of them that are having recruiting problems as well as logistical supply chain problems maintaining the equipment that they have now. Would you recommend re-examining that 20% major equipment requirement?
Well, I think the 20% of the 2% being for modernization is a good thing. It doesn't have to be necessarily new equipment. I think there's so many more ways that we could look at investment that ensures that the nations have what they do have is at the right level of readiness, but there are other things that we need.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I believe we have Mr. Keating. You are on the virtual platform there. We don't see a picture of you, and you are muted at the moment. So, Mr. Keating, are you with us? It would appear that he is not. And if so, that is all the people we have for questions. I really want to thank our witnesses today. This is not an easy setup, easy platform. I also really appreciate the work that the staff has gone into this. I mean, the reason we do this is because in the COVID environment, it is not a good idea to have a large number of people in an enclosed space. So we take advantage of the CVC and we take advantage of people being able to participate remotely so that they're not in the room, so that we can have fewer people in the room and hold the hearings. I don't enjoy this any more than anybody else does, and of the many things that we're all looking forward to getting back to doing, one of the big ones for me is to get back into 2118 and hold our hearings the way we normally do. We will do that as soon as the guidance from the healthcare officials here in the Capitol tell us that's safe to do. In the meantime, we'll continue to do hearings along these lines. We are trying to get one set up for next week. And with that, I will yield to Mr. Thornberry. He has no closing remarks. Then we are adjourned. Thank you all.